Have you ever had a conversation with someone and felt like they weren't listening? Like maybe they didn't even care about what you had to say? Not so long ago, life was a bit like that for women in Canada. They weren't allowed to vote. And if they spoke out and voiced their opinions, they could even be sent to jail. It was a time when women had more fear and less freedom, more rules and fewer rights. But 5 courageous Albertan women came together and changed it all. How, you might ask? Over a cup of tea. That's right, a cup of tea. But more on that in a minute. Almost 100 years ago, Emily Murphy, Irene Parlby, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Muir Edwards were fed up with the way things were. Emily Murphy was the first female magistrate in Canada and wanted to be appointed to the Senate. But since she was a woman, she wasn't eligible. The law at the time said it was a position for persons, a word which somehow didn't include women. The women who would become known as the Famous Five set out to change that. But since women were strongly discouraged from getting together and talking about politics, the Famous Five set up what they called pink teas. The name was a great disguise. People assumed that they were just having dainty tea parties, but in reality, they were planning their strategy to move forward gender equality in Canada. All the planning and work that occurred during the pink teas led to the Famous Five's first petition to the Supreme Court of Canada. It was not to be that easy. Their petition was rejected. But they weren't giving up. They decided to approach the highest possible court authority at the time, the Privy Council of England. And on October 18th, 1929, an amazing thing happened. The Famous Five's petition led to the ruling that women were included as persons under law. These 5 courageous women changed the course of history in Canada and the Commonwealth and paved the way for women to be considered equal in all aspects of life. Generations later, their actions continue to inspire Canadian women to be ambitious, adventurous, and famous. Today, the Famous Five Foundation works to create a society where every voice is heard, valued, and has the power to challenge and conquer injustice.
When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, equally the beech, the oaks, and the pines, they give off such hints of gladness. I would almost say that they save me, and daily. I'm so distant from the hope of myself, in which I have goodness and discernment, and never hurry through the world, but walk slowly and bow often. Around me the trees stir in their leaves and call out, "Stay a while." The light flows from their branches, and they call again. "It's simple," they say. And you too have come into the world to do this. To go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine.
Welcome. Welcome to another Famous Five Friday. And I begin by thanking Mango Wisdom for that beautiful video about the trees. It's called When I Am Among the Trees. It's a poem that was written by Mary Jane Oliver and recited today by Amanda Palmer. So our thanks to Mango Wisdom for allowing us to show the video today. And how lucky we all are to be gathering today on a Famous Five Friday, a day when women have more power and see more opportunities and hopefully seize more opportunities. Please continue chatting in the chat room throughout the program. And near the end of the program, you're going to be receiving another email, which will invite you to a Q&A session called Après Pink Tea. And that will be your chance to talk with the program participants, perhaps thank them, well, definitely thank them, and maybe ask some questions or for further clarification. So since we last met, we women benefited from International Women's Day. And I particularly want to thank all of you who honored the famous five on International Women's Day. The biggest thrill was the reintroduction of the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the Persons Case, which our fantastic Governor General, who you met last month, Mary Simon, reintroduced along with the federal government department called Wage and Youth. Wage is Women and Gender Equality. And so our thanks to those two groups for reintroducing the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the Persons Case. And more outstanding Canadian women and girls will be acknowledged on October 18th later this year. As well, our fabulous, famous Five Foundation Ottawa chapter had a reception for the recipients of the Governor General's Award this year. So our thanks to them and to two other groups that had invited me to come and make presentations about the famous five on International Women's Day. That's Nancy Griffiths from the Toronto area and the Calgary Public Library. Well, how lucky we all are to live in Canada, where there are many female leaders, and there have been female leaders for tens of thousands of years. And of course, I'm talking about our Indigenous sisters. We hope that at the end of this program, many of them and more of you will see that you're a leader too in your family, in your community, for others, perhaps people you don't even know. And so our land acknowledgement acknowledges and honors the authentic history of America and the people who were there. And now it's a chance for us as one step towards reconciliation to acknowledge that we're all treaty people, that we're all needed to build Canada. Because after all, when we sing our anthem, we sing true patriot love in all of us command. So it's up to all of us. Well, for the past 20 years, the Famous Five Foundation has had the pleasure of having Enbridge as our major sponsor. And we are delighted that they have decided they want to be the presenting sponsor for the virtual Pink Teas, which brings women from across Canada together once a month. And they have also enabled us to present other programs too over the years. One of the role models for today, and what we are doing is showing you a variety of women and a variety of different leadership models, comes from Enbridge, and her name is Corrine Miller. Since graduating from the University of Alberta, Corrine has been involved in the environmental field for nearly 22 years. She joined Enbridge about 9 years ago, first in Edmonton, but now in Calgary. And she has been the lead, let me read this, please. She has been the lead on a variety of Canadian liquids, gas, and power projects, and currently is the supervisor of environment for core projects at Enbridge. In her professional role, she's focused on the environment. In her personal role, she's focused on the environment. Corrine spends lots of time hiking and cross-country skiing and snowshoeing, and I guess even golf could be considered an environmental experience. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce Corrine, who will introduce our phenomenal panel today. And I'll be back just a little bit later. So Corrine, thank you for doing this, and it's over to you. Merci.
Enbridge exists to help fuel quality of life within the communities where we live, work, and operate. Every day, we're energizing communities through the volunteerism and the generosity of our employees and through the investments and partnerships that strengthen the safety, vibrancy, and sustainability of where we live. We collaborate with community leaders and organizations like the Famous Five Foundation to help build capacity, support programs that are inclusive, future thinking, and help bring the best in people, and where we know we can make impactful and sustainable change. Enbridge is also committed to building a diverse and inclusive workforce. We know that leading in complex and ambiguous environments require diversity of thought, experience, perspectives, and culture. To demonstrate our commitment, Enbridge announced a series of performance goals in 2020, including increasing the representation of women within our workforce. Enbridge is eager to have more women and girls develop an expertise in science. Like the rest of the world, we too need more women with a scientific background, and so it's my pleasure to introduce two outstanding female scientists who are also authors and community leaders. Dr. Suzanne Simard has become an internationally recognized forest ecologist based on her work as a professor at the University of British Columbia. In her recently published book entitled Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest, Dr. Simard explains the connectivity of trees, including recognizing the importance of the interrelationship of plants, microbes, soil, carbon, nutrients, and water. Her book challenges Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest and also includes her personal journey as a female scientist. In addition to its first printing being sold out, her book has now been translated into several languages, and Hollywood is interested in making a movie about Dr. Simard. Her commitment to our fundamental right to a clean and healthy environment means all of us will benefit from her leadership. Joining Dr. Simard today as our VIP host is Anne Moser, President and CEO of TELUS Spark, Calgary Science Centre, whose goal now is to become one of the top 10 most worth visiting science centres in the world by 2025. Anne's international reputation from her dedication to science and communication, as well as the annual Science, Engineering and Arts Festival, or Smash Up, known as Beakerhead. Together with her partner, author broadcaster Jay Ingram, Anne launched Beakerhead in 2011, which now draws tourists from all over the world. In addition to earning degrees in zoology and communication before completing a PhD in 2005, in November 2021, she became Dr. Moser when she was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws from the Mount Royal University. This impressive serial entrepreneur will now lead the conversation about the importance of science, the importance of discoveries, and the increasingly important leadership role of women in science with the remarkable Dr. Suzanne Simard. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And Suzanne, it is, I'm kind of starstruck because you're a star in the science world. We're going to talk for the first part of this lunch hour about how you got into science. Then we're going to take a couple of questions from some aspiring scientists, and then we'll dive deeper into your experience of being a female scientist, if that works for you.
That's great.
The impact of your research, I have to say, is entering the realm of legendary. So let's start with the jaw droppers. I know this is just like your work, but to me, it's whoa. I no longer look at trees and forests in the same way. What was your first major discovery?
Well, I guess the first major discovery was that trees are connected below ground in an internet, and that they share carbon and nitrogen and water. And I had been building up to that experiment for probably my entire life. If I think about it, I grew up in forests. My great-grandfather and grandfather were horse loggers, so I grew up around that. And I got to know the forest as this incredible place that was, cared for by people. And people were so much part of the forest as my family was. And then as I became a young forester, I realized that not everybody cares for forests, right? And that we were sort of losing that stewardship value that I had grown up, I was taught by my grandparents. Mm-hmm. And I became I worked for the forest industry, which was really bent on, or still is bent on, exploiting forests, also reforesting, but mostly it was about economic gain, and that wasn't always enmeshed with ecological wisdom or whatever held that forest together. And so I set about in my career trying to understand what we were pulling apart. And that led me to this discovery that trees are connected, that they live in community, that they are actually like societies where they have interdependence. They collaborate with each other to raise a healthy ecosystem. And yeah, so that was the first big discovery, was that they actually are connected and not ripped apart, like we were heading in that direction, and still to this day manage our forests under that premise that trees do not really collaborate with one another.
Yeah, that's big. I mean, you know, we look at a forest and above the ground, the trees stand alone, but below the ground, there is this, they're connected. In your book, you talk about some other really major discoveries that they're not just connected and communicating. What are some of the other things that you've discovered that they're doing?
Yeah, so you know, I eventually became a professor at UBC, and I had a lot of graduate students who worked on this "what's next" question that you asked me. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand how old trees facilitate or encourage the regeneration of new trees. And eventually this led us to discover that in looking at these networks and trying to understand what they do, that all of the trees are connected in the forest, not just a few, that everything is as one unit almost, and that at the center of these networks are these big old trees, and that they really do nurture the new generations coming up. And so we, as a group, we decided to start calling these big old trees mother trees. And I would say that was the next leap forward, was that, yeah, that these big old trees were sort of like the nucleus of the forest, like, you know, like the elders in our own human communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what kinds of things are they sharing with each other?
Yeah, it's very complex. And really, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of that. But what I focused on was really, I started out looking at what we call resources in forest ecology. So those basic things that trees and plants need, which are photosynthate, which is really light energy converted into photosynthate or carbon sugars. They need nutrients from the soil, and they need water. And so I started looking at all of those things and how they're shared between trees and competed for, and found out that all of those resources are moving back and forth between trees all the time, like, you know, very rapidly, and in very responsively to the shifting resources availability to each tree, so that the whole unit, the whole community is in this, you know, it's almost like a wave, you know, coming over the ocean, that it's always moving and going up and down according to who needs resources. So that's one thing. And then the next thing it led us to is other kinds of information that these trees might be sharing. And so the next question we looked at was, do these trees, we knew that they could help the little seedlings, the seedlings come along, but we asked, do they actually know which ones are their own offspring, their own kin? And so we discovered that they do recognize kin. And so those kin recognition signals, what are those signals, right? Is it a chemical signal, or is it something else? And so just the discovery they recognize their kin was massive, but also to understand that it really is about sharing, again, of their energy, their photosynthate. And so these old trees are energizing their young offspring to give them that head start.
Amazing. So when you say it's happening quite quickly, like how quickly? 24 hours?
Oh yeah, within minutes, honestly. I mean, we've looked at, you know, in science, we hadn't figured out how to look at the shifting patterns over seconds, but we would look at it over minutes and hours and days. And so within about 4 hours of changing, you know, maybe the shading of one tree, or how much nutrients a tree has, that response is shifted or is communicated to its neighbors within a few hours, 4 hours. But I think if we had better techniques, we would see that shifting or that communication is actually more in real time. It happens instantaneously. And the reason I think that is when you're in a forest and you're able to measure photosynthetic rates, for example. We have little machines that allow you to do that. They're called gas analyzers, and you can actually take a leaf and put it in the gas analyzer and change. And as a cloud moves over the forest, the photosynthetic rate drops instantaneously. And so these trees are incredibly responsive to light, to the conditions of the forest. They're it's our own responses to each other. We're, instantaneously, in communication with each other. And this also happens in trees. They're so perceptive.
It's like the forest is an organism.
In a sense, it's a system, and an organism is like a single, but even an organism we know is a consortium of other organisms, because we're, even as people, we're full of bacteria and viruses and all kinds of creatures that live in and on us. But an ecosystem is a system of all kinds of creatures that does behave as a society. And even like an organism in some ways, but I prefer to use the word society because it shows that it's the collective that works together.
Right. Okay. Society. So do you think somewhere in the back of your mind, you set out to change the way the world looks at a forest? You talked a little bit about your upbringing.
I guess that I have, I've always wanted to make it better for forests, because I knew that we needed to protect our forests and be good caretakers of them. And I could see that was not happening. And even for other ecosystems as well. I know from a very young age, I was worried about water and plants, and even outside of forests. So I always wanted to make sure that the ecosystems were healthy. And so I guess it really was in me from the very beginning. I think we have our natural talents, and that's one of mine.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Can you remember a day in your childhood that was particularly memorable?
In terms of this topic, there were many. I remember falling out of a tree. That was memorable. I was, about 3 or 4. I remember trying to climb a tree to touch God. That was really memorable. And then I fell out of the tree. But I think, one of the other things I remember is when I was in about grade 2, our principal of our elementary school took us up to this garbage dump. And the whole school walked up it. We must have walked 5 kilometers. And so a little kid, that's quite far. And we went to clean up the garbage dump. And so we spent as a school several days going back up to this garbage dump and cleaning it up. And that had a profound impact on me. It told me that people can make a huge difference, in damage, but also in caring for and helping and helping the environment recover. So that was a very positive experience for me.
Finding the sense that, or realizing that you can do something.
Yeah.
It stuck with you because
it really stuck with me. Yeah, his name was Mr. Shaw. I'm sure he's passed on, but I always remember he took all of these little kids, what a generous man, and showed us that we had agency in our own future, really, in our own environment.
Yeah. Showing, not telling.
Yeah.
What's your earliest recollection of wanting to be a scientist, or did you have that thought?
I think it was in me from a very early age, even though I might not have articulated it. I loved being in the forest. I was a kid of the forest. My family spent so much time in the bush. And so I always just loved that place. And I remember when I was like in grade 5 and I asked for a chemistry set for my birthday, and I got one, and I thought, I'm a scientist now. Okay. So I guess I always had that. And that moment when I had this little chemistry set and I was making all these potions, and just like, your average kid that likes chemistry, I thought I could do this. I've got some aptitude for this. So, but, even before that, I think I just was born to do that.
Yeah. So you talked about your teacher there. Were there other people in your childhood that really inspired you, or especially in terms of asking questions and doing research?
Yeah, I had so many inspirations, and I have to say, those mentors are so very important, especially as a young girl when science wasn't really accessible to us. So I was born in 1960, and really at that time, girls really had very few options. We could be secretaries or telephone operators or teachers or nurses, and that was pretty much what I was told were my options, or to stay home and raise children, which which is a great thing to do. But I really felt like I didn't have that many options. But I remember following my grandfather around. He was a logger. He loved the forest. He used to make trails with his pickaxe by himself. He just loved being out there alone and, just being there. And I learned so much about caring for plants and trees from him, and soils. And he was a big influence. And then later, as I got a little older, and I actually entered into the Faculty of Forestry at UBC, right at the time that they started allowing girls into forestry. They really were not letting us in until about 1978. And it was so dominated by men, and all the professors were men, and almost all the students were boys or males. And so I didn't feel like I belonged, and it was really hard. And I remember meeting a friend who is still my best friend. Her name is Jean. And I had been sort of thinking, I don't know if I can stick with this, right? Even though I love the forest. And she just said to me, this is the best field to be in ever. She said, forestry is the best ever. And she taught me so much, right? We just spent all our time hiking and camping and, canoeing and biking. And I don't know, there was something really about her enthusiasm that I thought, okay, I'm going to stick with this. And I've never looked back, and we still work together.
So you and Jean were both in forestry school together?
Yes.
And how come she wasn't daunted by the fact that were you the only two females, or very few?
I think there were about 10 of us. There were very few of us, and I didn't have any female friends. I mean, I think that we were so diluted and diluted, not diluted.
Yeah.
And I think just trying to survive, and I was kind of shy. I was very shy, and so most of my friends were boys, and in school. And then she was my first female friend, and I just felt like suddenly I belonged there, because she felt like she belonged. And I don't know what it was about her. I think, she was a little older than me, so she'd had a little more experience. Her dad had taught her a lot about the forest. She'd made a lot of trails with her dad. I don't know. There was something that she had, this great confidence, and that allowed her to just embrace it full on without ever feeling unsure of herself.
So it's like it was the beginning of the network that you ended up studying.
Yes, that's right. I mean, and really and I always tell my students this too, that when you go through an undergraduate degree, or any kind of schooling, high school, your undergraduate degree is really important, because that's when you're starting to establish your discipline. And the students that you meet there become your colleagues, and you start forming that network, and it grows and grows and grows through your career. And the relationships you build become your strength, that you can always rely on your colleagues. It's really an amazing thing to go through a career like that and just see it grow into this beautiful network.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have that network to sort of create strength, and you were working in this male-dominated field. So it starts to really sort of sound a little bit like it is going in parallel with what you're discovering and how you describe it in your book.
Yeah, so because there were so few female scientists, when I was becoming an ecologist, a lot of the field of ecology was male. The thinking was very male. So in my field, in forestry, it became, and I mentioned at the beginning how it is such an economically driven field, the field of forestry. And so the male thinking was, how do we grow more timber faster so we can make more money from it? In the very colonial sense of it. and so it became all about, how do we manage competition? Like these trees are only competing with each other. So let's weed out those plants and trees we don't want so we can grow these, these bigger trees that we can then harvest for the future. And by not, really not thinking outside of the box of that. And it was very much in line with Darwinian thinking about survival of the fittest. It was reinforced by that, where there is a lot of credence to that theory, of course, but it became such an parochial view of how forests were structured. And it wasn't until I think that I started going, wait a minute, this is too simple. It's way more complex than this, that these relationships are way more nuanced. It's not just about who gets a zero-sum game about who wins and who loses. Yeah. It's about working together. And so that's what led me to ask these questions. And, I don't think that, and I've really taken it to really understand those complex relationships. And I really think it was that female perspective that allowed me to really investigate, these, how forests are structured and their process are just so much more complex than we at first thought.
Yeah. So that was a challenging view. How did you deal with the resistance and the controversy that started to emerge fairly early on to your way of looking at a forest?
Yeah, how did I handle it? For one thing, I have to, tip my hat to my supervisor. I was in the Ministry of Forests in British Columbia when my work was first published in the journal Nature. And I think because it was in that high profile journal, it attracted a lot of attention and criticism. But I had a supervisor, Alan Weiss, who always stood behind me. And that helped enormously. I always knew I had him at my back. But even so, it was really hard. I was having children at the time. I was fielding calls from, reporters, and then often I was not well versed in how to talk to reporters, and making mistakes along the way, saying things I probably shouldn't have said, or being a little bit more bold and and not understanding that actually there are these sort of like critics out there. And so I had to learn very quickly, and I had a lot of bruises as I went through. And I think if I look back now and how I conduct myself now is I'm a little wiser, but I also, I worked so hard to make sure that my story was fuller and that I have more of a network to support me, that when those inevitable criticisms come along, that I'm just better able to deal with them. But, when I was in my early and mid 30s, I had to learn I learned a lot of hard lessons. It was not easy. I think, girls going forward, just make sure you've got some good mentors behind you.
Yeah. Okay. We are going to pick up on that in just a few minutes. But first, we want to take some questions from a couple of young aspiring scientists before we get too much into the kind of persistence that it takes. So as not to scare them off. Let's hear first from Carly. Now, both of these aspiring scientists are in grade 6. Let's hear from Carly.
I enjoy science, like you. And I just entered a science fair project about how different types of water, such as rainwater, and tap water with fluoride, affect plant growth. The name of my project is I Want My Plants. How does different types of water affect plant growth? Do you have any memorable science fair experiences from when you were in school?
That's such a great question. I love it. I went into a science fair when I was in grade 5, and I made this model of the human ear and out of clay and plasticine, and I won a 3rd prize. I won a book. But you know what? It wasn't really an experiment like yours. You were actually testing things, like comparing different kinds of water. And that is much more interesting than a static model. You're actually looking at a dynamic system and then looking for results and making these comparisons. And so good for you. You know, that's so exciting, and you'll get results really quickly, and that keeps you inspired and keep going. And then you can ask the next question. And I bet you'll find out that, you know, that when you've got, for example, fluoride in your water, it can act like a little bit of a salt or an ion, and it will affect how your plants take up that water, because they're very sensitive to the ions that are in water. They can either, you know, reject them or take them in more. So it'll affect the water balance of your plants. So it sounds great.
Yeah, Carly also understands one of the key things in a science career, in my perspective, which is how to communicate science. She's got our interest with the title of her experiment being, I Wet My Plants. Yeah, so cute.
Really,
you know, I was reflecting on early science fair experiments, and I actually didn't ever enter a science fair. I don't know why, it just wasn't on my radar, but we did so many science experiments as kids, as we played, you know, in the forest. We used to find leeches in the river and then move our hands and see how long it would take before the leech could attach. Or, you know, we'd find crayfish underneath rocks and clasp them onto our fingers and see how long they could hang on. All kinds of, you know, just ad hoc experiences. Okay, we have another question now from Zoe.
When I grow up, I also want to be a scientist. As women in science, what is some advice you would give to young girls who also want to pursue science? Thank you so much.
You know, I would say don't be afraid to try things. Like, I think, you know, when you get into the field of science, especially as you move up, you hear a lot of things like, you can't do that, or don't try. We've already figured this thing out. I went through this myself. We've got that figured out. Don't let that stop you, because, you know, there's always things to understand, and don't feel like somebody's got it all wrapped up and that's their field. I would say just go for it, right? If you're curious and you think there's something that we don't know yet, or we're on the wrong track, just persevere and don't be afraid when someone says don't do it.
I love that quote. It's often attributed to Mark Twain, like most great quotes, that says, we didn't know it was impossible, so we did it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. You know, my advice for Zoe along the lines of perseverance is inspired by a conversation that I had yesterday with a very wise gentleman who said, you know, you need three things: purpose, passion, and perseverance. The purpose and passion are pretty easy to come by, and lots of people have it. It's the perseverance that really sets people apart. And speaking of perseverance, Suzanne, let's turn the corner here, the page here, and dive a little bit deeper into your career, because honestly, your perseverance is so impressive to someone like me who, you know, and we all know the stats. We know that women leave science at every juncture. You know, they enter in pretty equal numbers, but they fall off with every graduate degree and with every threshold into having a career. And it seems to me that you've been breaking ground on two fronts at once throughout your career, you know, your science findings and then also being female. You know, we talked a little bit about where you found the ability to persevere, but what would you say to others about finding the ability to persevere?
Yeah, I think, you know, the thing that's made me persevere is that I'm a kid I grew up in forests. I love forests, and I also saw them disappearing over the course of my lifetime. You know, I grew up in the old growth, old forests, and then they've been being clear cut, you know, systematically over my life. And that to me became a mission, right? Like, I needed to help save these places that I knew from my own life that they were places of life, that they provide life for us. And so I never stopped being a defender of the forest.
Right.
So I guess my message is, when you find that thing that you just love so much that becomes your life's passion, that's what drives you forward. It's not like you're going, oh, I've got to persevere through this, like this thing again. It's more like, okay, I got to keep going for that thing I love, which for me was the forest.
Yeah.
For, it could be helping other people get through, injury or psychological problems. It could be anything. But once you've figured out that's your thing, your talent, your passion, it stick with it, because we need people to stick with things and become experts. And, it's the experts that really move science forward, like that. I mean, there's always surprises, but, and people coming in new to the field, but there's always a need for the people who persevere, build their scientific questions and really drive forward and find out new things. So that, finding that thing is really, really, really important.
So would you say perseverance comes from not so much how you're dealing with today, but from having your eye on the prize, from staying focused on the world you want to build?
I think it does. I mean, for me, that's definitely been it. It's having my eye on the prize, the thing I thought was the most important thing, carving out my niche. Although, you don't have to be the only person doing that one thing. I'm not the only person looking at plant communication and in trees. These fields, are complex questions that need lots of people looking at them, and for us to work together so we can solve some of these big problems. So you don't have to go off on your own. It's better. Well, I shouldn't say it's better. It's good to have your collaborators around you so that you can become involved as a team figuring out these new complicated things. Yeah.
So the science ideas were, having to be sort of socialized, and you were breaking ground there. Did you experience discrimination as a female in your career? And how did that get expressed? How does that discrimination get expressed?
Yeah, well, so keeping in mind of my time, when I first started working I worked in the forest industry for a forest company in the early 1980s. So that seems like a long, long time ago, but really it's not that long ago. And being one of the first girls in the industry, we were sort of token. We were allowed in, but we weren't allowed to move upwards. And so that was the first. That was the first real hardship, I think, other than there were a lot of day-to-day things, the jokes, the boys club that you weren't part of. You were never really one of them. So that was hard. I just kept trying and trying. And then when I got passed over for the job I really wanted, I thought, okay, I'm not going to keep hurting myself because I'll never get there. So I shifted. I went for an easier path that would still allow me to be, a forest defender. And I worked in government. I worked as a consultant. I did all kinds of things to keep moving forward. And eventually, I was always striving to get to a point where I could have more of a say, that I had more control over my career and what I was trying to do. So it was a matter of being strategic, even though at the time I wasn't thinking I was being strategic, but I was, right? I was protecting myself by not staying in it when it was becoming damaging, and then finding that pathway that would get me to where I wanted to be.
Yeah. Is it changing? Is it changing now?
It's definitely changing. I mean, it's easier to have a career in a science like mine. Now I teach undergraduate forest ecology to students at UBC, and at least half of the class is female, whereas when I started, they were 10%. There are female professors in forestry where there were 0 before. Now about 15% of us or 20% are female. That's progress. I would say that, you don't see deans very often that are deans of forestry that are female. So there still are barriers, at those higher levels. And we really do need to break down those barriers because it does affect what goes on down in the lower levels. What gets taught, for example, or new ways of looking at things. Like, I think that if we had more women in there, the field of ecology would have moved along a lot more quickly, and we would have corrected some of our, mismanagement of forests sooner. So getting that diversity in there really makes it's really important about what happens at the global scale. So it is changing, but it still needs to keep changing. And the more girls that go in, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah. I understand from your book that one of your daughters wants to be a scientist. Is that still true?
Yeah, actually, both of my daughters are in forestry.
Oh.
They're both. One of them is working for a First Nations forestry company, and doing all kinds of silviculture and finding different ways to look after forests. And my other daughter is in her 4th year at UBC and doing sort of like Indigenous studies with plants and root crops and medicinal plants. So both girls are following in my footsteps, which I'm very, very proud of.
Yes, I would be too. And knowing that your career hasn't been the easiest, that's even that much more impressive, right?
Yeah, and they had to come along with me, right? When I was going through a lot of, like, as a professor, I had my children when I was in my mid to late 30s, and it's when I lost my job in government and moved to becoming a professor. And when you're a prof, there's it's not a cakewalk. And so my little girls had to do that with me. And it wasn't always easy. Like I was away. Sometimes I was stressed. I was working really hard, but they still didn't get turned off of it, right? I think now they're very proud of where they came from, even though it was not always easy.
Yeah. Oh, that's super cool. That's super inspiring. And inspiring. I understand you were the scientist that inspired the scientist character in the Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Overstory. How much of that?
I was one of them.
One of them, yeah. Yeah.
What was your question?
Well, how much of that is you? How much of that character?
Quite a bit. Patricia Westerford was a low-key, flying under the radar kind of scientist, and I always felt that way myself, even though my science eventually became really well known. But and so she was quite quiet and reserved. And then when the critics came out, like they did in my career, like basically she went through what I went through, and it really caused her to pull back. Because it was so disparaging. Whereas I was able to keep going forward because I think I had, I think I probably had more support around me. I had a position, but anyway, it was very much based on me, and yeah, it's pretty cool. I think the one difference is that, I'm still moving along and making discoveries, and I'll never stop, right? This is my lifelong vocation. I will always be a person of the forest, always trying to care for the forest and figure things out. I think Patricia Westerford, well, the book ended, so we didn't actually know what happened, but I think she had a lot more, maybe more barriers than I did in that book.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of books, Finding the Mother Tree, that has really gripped a lot of people. What's happened to your career since this book has been published?
Yeah, my career's changed quite a lot, actually. I've always been very much out in the forest and working with my students, or very much, in the trenches. I would always like to say in the trenches of the science. And just in the last year since the book came out, there's been a lot more opportunity, I would say, an interest in conveying these ideas. And I'm just grabbing onto those opportunities because I feel like the world needs to know, so that we can actually make choices as a society about our future, and that we don't have to have climate change being as as tragic as it's going to be. We can make choices that will make things easier for the future, to make things easier for the next generations. And so I just feel like it's my job right now, and I'm grabbing onto it to convey what those choices are. We can't, what we can do differently to make the future a better place.
Mm-hmm. Just like your grade 5 teacher made you realize we have agency. You are passing along that mantle.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, is there a movie in the works about?
There is. So when I published my book, I have an agent, Doug Abrams, at a company called Idea Architects, and it was his idea really to take the book to William Morris Entertainment to see, do you think that anybody would be interested in making this into a movie? And so, yes, there was lots of interest. And so, yes, there's going to be a movie. Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal got together and put a bid on the story. And yeah, it's going to get produced, I hope, in the next couple of years.
And so who is going to play you? Is that already known?
That's going to be Amy Adams.
And that's good. That's incredible.
I know. I just think, oh, wow, I'm so thrilled. And I think she's like such an incredible person. I love her acting. She was in Arrival. She was in Hillbilly Elegy, and she's a gritty character. Yeah. And that grittiness and intellect and sensitivity, I think, comes because she comes from a great big family. And so she had to be sort of a scrapper and a survivor. And I love that. That's what I've been in my career in forestry. Yeah. So I think she's a perfect fit for the role.
That's so exciting. Do you have a timeline on that?
Well, right now they're still trying to find a director. And so that's where I know it's at. And then a screenplay has to be written. And then I think they said it would be within a year or two. So not too long, I hope.
Okay, well, we'll all have our eyes peeled for that. In the meantime, are you going to be able to get back into the forest? And if so, what are you working on now? What are you asking?
Yeah, I'm in the forest a lot still. I mean, these days I'm on camera quite a bit, but I have this big project in British Columbia called the Mother Tree Project that I've been doing for the last 5 years. And that is trying to demonstrate, but also to discover how you can leave old trees, mother trees, even if you're going to harvest some trees, for wood products, like, to build houses and make paper and so on. How do you leave these old trees behind so that they can continue to nourish the ecosystems? And there's all kinds of ways that you can do that. And what we're discovering is that how you do that depends on what the climate is like in that place. And then as climate changes, again, that will shape how we protect these old trees. And what we're finding so far is that when you leave old trees behind, even as you might thin some trees out from around them, that it's good for climate change. It keeps carbon in the ground and in the forest. Instead of emitting it to the atmosphere, it keeps biodiversity remains high. And then the forest regenerates so readily. So it's really such a great natural solution to climate change. And, keeping in mind that there's two major reasons why we've got climate changing. It's because we are dependent on fossil fuels, but also because we're doing things like forestry practices. And so there are solutions out there. And so the Mother Tree Project is finding solutions.
Awesome. And citizens can get involved, right?
Yes, anybody can get involved. And we're trying to build this into a Mother Tree network that's more global, so that if you have, we're getting requests from the boreal forest, from European forests, from South America. Can they try this? Can they leave old trees behind, and how would they do that? So we're starting to work and expand that network, and anybody can put forward an idea and get help with that and become involved.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Frances has joined us now to ask some questions.
Well, yes, I certainly have, but I've been loving what I've been hearing, and how exciting to hear the progress that not only did your research, Suzanne, end up being valuable scientifically, and then, of course, with your fantastic book, which we love, and I encourage everybody to read, because it's also a story about you too. But to have a movie and to have Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal, that's fantastic. That's really fantastic. But my job right now is to ask the two of you some lightning questions. I'm going to make a statement and ask you for just 2 or 3 words so that people can learn from you two, my fabulous role models, about how to cope in certain situations. So the first situation is confusion. So when you are confused, what do you do? So Suzanne, when I am confused, I
try to understand what's causing that confusion, make sense of my world.
You don't go immediately to the forest?
If I can, I will, but I can't always do that. So you figure it out.
Your answer was a much more sophisticated and appropriate than my cheeky response. Marianne, what do you do? When I am confused, I
research.
Thank you. Second one is when I am scared, I Suzanne.
When I'm scared, I crawl under the covers. No, I'm just kidding. No, I don't. I'd really try to reach out to my friends and get them to help alleviate my fears. That's where your networks really come in important.
Yeah, definitely a good strategy. Marianne, if ever you are scared, what do you do?
Oh, I'm often scared. I get really calm and frighteningly bossy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Sort of overcompensate?
Yeah, probably.
So the third one is when I am sad, Suzanne, what do you do when you're sad?
That's when I really go out to the forest and try to understand why I'm sad. And I reach out to my best friend, Jean, and we talk about it.
Well, our hats off to Jean for all the help that she's given you. Marianne, so when you are sad, what do you do?
I cry.
Do you do this in public? Do you do this on the job?
No.
Why not?
No. See, earlier reference to scared, I just get calm.
And when you're... Go ahead. And when you're sad?
I tend not to cry in public, but maybe I will learn to.
And so the fourth question is, if the famous 5 were alive today, they would ... Suzanne, what do you think the famous 5 would be doing today if they were alive?
Continuing to encourage us to move forward.
Thank you. Marianne, if they were alive today, they would
be working on non-violent ways to resolve these global conflicts.
I thought for sure the two of you might say they would have been scientists. They would have given up the advocacy on social issues and they would have moved into science and had some discoveries. But your answers are very respectful of what.
We need women to do all those things.
Of course, Suzanne. My apologies. I shouldn't be limiting the famous 5 or other women at all. So thank you. Well, dear friends, we're at a pink tea, and that means we're a group of women gathering to talk about our lives and to figure out how to take on a project or to resolve an issue that we've had or our friends have had so that it helps other people. And I'm hoping that you have a cup of tea or a glass or a mug, because we would like to toast, of course, first to Suzanne, then Marianne, and then the other program participants. So for Suzanne, well, Suzanne, you just concluded a week of Canada Reads for CBC. I was riveted. Your explanations were so thoughtful, so eloquent, and I would encourage everybody to Google CBC or Canada Reads, because while previously it's only been an audio program on the radio, it now is on TV. And the fascinating discussions with the 5 books and the 5 champions. And you will hear more about Suzanne, her thoughts and her explanations, both about the books and also about life. So, Suzanne, it's really easy to understand why you have 10 million plus people who have enjoyed your TED Talks and obviously bought your books, both your scientific knowledge and your understanding of life, and particularly, which we haven't discussed today, your journey through cancer. Suzanne, you are very inspiring. And so, colleagues, if you might raise a glass, a teacup, and toast to Dr. Suzanne Simard. To Suzanne.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And I'm hoping somebody out there is compiling, Suzanne, your achievements, because Canada has only had one woman win a Nobel Prize. And I think, colleagues, we're looking at a really good possibility for another. So contributing to the success of the virtual Pink Tea today, of course, was our VIP host, to Mary Anne Moser. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm for science, Mary Anne, and your superb communication abilities. You really have helped us to get to know Dr. Simard and her scientific life much, much more profoundly. And so a toast to the talented Mary Anne Moser today for our VIP host, to Mary Anne.
Mary Anne.
And we're, of course, all excited and delighted, Mary Anne, that you are going to reignite the spark in TELUS Spark, our science center, and that you're going to be able, as you have said, hopefully to marry both TELUS Spark and Beakerhead, the smash up of art and engineering and science. It was so thrilling in the city of Cal. You brought us to life with all the different events. And because you're probably sleeping, Mary Anne, 4 or 5 hours a day, I think you should think about taking Beakerhead to the world. So only sleep 2 or 3 hours for the next little while. Okay. And lastly, to our wonderful young people who helped today bring science into our lives and to see the possibility and the joy. What weren't the two girls so happy to be scientists? And they are scientists. They're not aspiring, they are. So if we might have a toast to Zoe and to Carly, and also to Corinne for the work that she's doing, to the wonderful young scientists. Well, this turned out for a non-scientific person to be absolutely a fascinating virtual Pink Tea. And it's largely because of Dr. Suzanne Simard and because of Mary Anne Moser. So thank you two very much for enlightening us today. And both will be joining us shortly for the après Pink Tea. And you should have received a link in your email box so that you can join us at the Pink Tea, or indeed it will show up shortly in the, if it hasn't already, I don't get to see it, unfortunately, the chat room. And come and ask more questions and personally thank these two amazing women. So I'm now going to ask the talented Encore crew to allow Mary Anne and Suzanne to take a bit of a break, and I'm going to bring you some Famous Five news. And the first is regarding the right of Canadian women to be equal. This was started, of course, by the Famous Five and other women, but on April the 13th, 1982, our Charter of Rights was declared. And there were a number of brilliant and persistent women that insisted in the Charter had to be gender equality. And it's particularly featured in sections 15 and 28. Well, a new group has come together with the support of the Famous Five Foundation, and that organization is called the Women's History Project. And on April the 13th, so in 12 days' time, we're going to be launching a celebration of the Charter of Rights, and specifically as it applies to gender equality. So you will see a link again, and on the notice that follows this virtual Pink Tea, you will get more information about it. So that's on April the 13th. And then on May 6th, our next virtual Pink Tea is concerning women, sexuality, and rights. And leading the discussion about the contributions of lesbian and non-binary women to Canada will be the Honourable Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario. She will be joined by a tech genius by the name of Bobby Richette. So that's on May the 6th, and that's our next event. On June 3rd, we're going to talk about women in energy. Women in oil and gas, women in hydro, women in green energy companies. And then over the summer, we're planning to do a tribute to Viola Desmond, and as well to pay tribute to one of the women that led the right for Indigenous women to remain Indigenous women and for their children to be considered Indigenous, even though they married non-Indigenous partners. And that's Jeanette Corbert-Laval, a remarkable woman. And her daughter, Dawn Laval Harvard, a professor at Trent, will be joining us, as well as her daughter. So it's grandmother, mother, and granddaughter, all working for Indigenous women's rights. And now our last toast is to each and every one of us, because I hope you are recognizing that you are a leader too. You're a leader in your family, you are a leader in your community, you're a leader in your profession. And so please raise a toast and say, I go shoulders back, then you breathe deep and you say, to me, I'm a leader too. To me, I'm a leader too. Are you ready? To me, I'm a leader too. Thank you. So unfortunately, that's the end of our virtual pink tea for April. It's not an April Fool's joke. It was absolutely wonderful. And I know that you had some good chuckles in it. So please join us now for the après pink tea, where our Director of Events, Prita Kolar, will be waiting for you. And again, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, girls. Thank you, Corinne. And thank you to each and everyone who joined us today. Merci, miigwech.
Thank you. Merci.
Bye-bye.
Have you ever had a conversation with someone and felt like they weren't listening? Like maybe they didn't even care about what you had to say? Not so long ago, life was a bit like that for women in Canada. They weren't allowed to vote. And if they spoke out and voiced their opinions, they could even be sent to jail. It was a time when women had more fear and less freedom, more rules and fewer rights. But 5 courageous Albertan women came together and changed it all. How, you might ask? Over a cup of tea. That's right, a cup of tea. But more on that in a minute. Almost 100 years ago, Emily Murphy, Irene Parlby, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Muir Edwards were fed up with the way things were. Emily Murphy was the first female magistrate in Canada and wanted to be appointed to the Senate. But since she was a woman, she wasn't eligible. The law at the time said it was a position for persons, a word which somehow didn't include women. The women who would become known as the Famous Five set out to change that. But since women were strongly discouraged from getting together and talking about politics, the Famous Five set up what they called pink teas. The name was a great disguise. People assumed that they were just having dainty tea parties, but in reality, they were planning their strategy to move forward gender equality in Canada. All the planning and work that occurred during the pink teas led to the Famous Five's first petition to the Supreme Court of Canada. It was not to be that easy. Their petition was rejected. But they weren't giving up. They decided to approach the highest possible court authority at the time, the Privy Council of England. And on October 18th, 1929, an amazing thing happened. The Famous Five's petition led to the ruling that women were included as persons under law. These 5 courageous women changed the course of history in Canada and the Commonwealth and paved the way for women to be considered equal in all aspects of life. Generations later, their actions continue to inspire Canadian women to be ambitious, adventurous, and famous. Today, the Famous Five Foundation works to create a society where every voice is heard, valued, and has the power to challenge and conquer injustice.